Okay, when you hear the term domestic abuse, what's the first image that pops into your head? For a lot of us, it's a pretty specific picture. But what if the data tells a much, much broader story, one that's mostly hidden? Well, today we're going to dig into a 2024 study that pulls back the curtain on a reality many of us just don't see, and the powerful stigmas that keep it locked away.
All right, let's just start with a number, a big one. And honestly, it might just stop you in your tracks. According to this research, about 757,000 men in the UK experience domestic abuse every single year. To give you a sense of that scale, that's enough people to fill Wembley Stadium more than 8 times over. So yeah, we're not talking about a small fringe issue here. This is massive. So that number begs the question, right? If this is happening to so many people, why aren't we talking about it more? This quote, which the study cites, gets right to the heart of it. Male victims of domestic violence and abuse, or DVA, are often trivialized. The problem isn't just that people don't know, it's that they're actively dismissed, not just by society, but sometimes by the very professionals who are supposed to help. Okay, so how do you even begin to tackle a stigma that big? Well, the researchers knew they had to understand it first. They had to really map it out. Their whole study was basically built to answer a couple of key questions. Why are these victims so hidden? And what are the specific barriers keeping them in the dark? And what they found is this. It's a real perfect storm of challenges. It kicks off internally, right? You've got these societal pressures on men to be the strong, stoic one, which makes it incredibly difficult to even see yourself as a victim. Then there's a general lack of understanding about what abuse even is beyond physical violence, especially things like coercive control. And even if a man gets past all that, he then has to face a support system that often feels like it just wasn't designed for him, which just fuels that fear that no one will believe him, or worse, that he'll be ridiculed for it. So how do you actually measure a bias? I mean, it's one thing to say it exists, but how do you prove it? Well, the researchers came up with a pretty clever 2-part study. First up, they ran an experiment to try and put a real number on this bias, to see how our perceptions change based on nothing but the victim's gender. So here's the setup. It was actually pretty simple. They got 202 people together and had them each read a short story, a little scenario describing an act of domestic violence. After they finished reading, they were just asked to judge the victim on a 7-point scale. Simple as that. But here is the genius part. Not everyone read the exact same story. The researchers tweaked 2 little things. First, in some versions, the victim was a man, and in others, a woman. And second, some of the stories included what they called a justification. In this case, that the victim had cheated. This way, they could see exactly what was influencing people's opinions. Was it the gender? Was it the behavior? Or both? And when the results came in, whoa, they were pretty stark. When the victim in the story was male, he got an average judgment score of 4.49. But when the victim was female, in the exact same scenario, that score jumped up to a more supportive 5.20. That gap, that's the bias, right there in the data. All things being equal, men were judged more harshly. Period. But that wasn't the only thing the experiment uncovered. It also showed us something else about how we judge victims. Whenever infidelity was part of the story, the victim's score, whether they were male or female, plummeted to 4.30. Without it, the score was way up at 5.39. It just goes to show how quickly our minds can flip to blaming the victim the second their behavior seems less than perfect. But, numbers only ever tell part of the story. So now let's pivot to the second part of the research, which is where we get to hear the human side of all this. The researchers sat down and did these really in-depth interviews with men to understand what their actual lived experiences were. And this first quote just hits so hard because it shows you that first barrier we talked about. This man, who is a victim, literally says it's not really abuse, just because there was no physical violence. It's a perfect, heartbreaking example of how our society's narrow focus on physical abuse makes people completely invalidate their own trauma.
Okay, so let's say a man does get past that first hurdle and recognizes he's a victim. What's next? Well, that's where the next wall goes up. As this participant puts it, I can't think of any helplines for men. It captures that deep feeling that the entire support system, the whole infrastructure, just isn't there for you.
And this right here, this is where the stories from the interviews perfectly line up with the numbers from the experiment. Remember how that experiment showed people judge men more harshly? Well, this is the real-world result of that. It's this deep-seated fear that if you report it, the very people who are supposed to help you, like the police, are just gonna laugh at you. You see, these aren't just one-off stories. When the researchers put them all together, a really clear pattern emerged. They boiled it down to 3 key themes. First, an inability for men to even identify what's happening to them as abuse. Second, a support system with huge, glaring shortcomings for male victims. And third, a fundamental doubt about male victimization, a fear of not being believed by the criminal justice system. So you've got the hard data on one side and these powerful personal stories on the other. You put them together and you get this incredibly clear picture of the problem. But the great thing about this study is it doesn't just stop there. It doesn't just point out the issue. It also lays out a roadmap for how we can start to fix it. The researchers suggest a 3-step game plan. First, it has to start with public education. We have to change the conversation and raise awareness about what this kind of abuse actually looks like. Second, that education needs to be backed up with real, practical training for all the professionals on the front lines, police, social workers, you name it. And finally, all of this has to be supported from the top down by making sure our policies are genuinely gender inclusive so that everyone gets equal support. You know what this research really does is it challenges us to look past our own gut reactions and our own assumptions. It shows in black and white how stigma can be a massive barrier to getting help and finding justice. And it leaves all of us with a really important question to think about. How can we, as a society, evolve our understanding and our systems to make sure we see, believe, and support all victims of domestic abuse?